"You worthless thief!" The words sliced through the morning air like a blade finding flesh, and Lyra felt them settle deep in her chest where all the other cruelties lived. She had been carefully oiling the ceremonial weapons in the armory when Marcus, the Beta's son, discovered her there among the sacred blades. She kept her head down, her hands steady on the ancient steel, despite the trembling that wanted to take hold. This was her job, had been her job for 3 years since they decided she was good for nothing else. Clean the weapons, oil the leather, polish the silver, stay invisible. But Marcus stepped closer, his boots heavy on the stone floor, and she could smell the aggression rolling off him in waves. "You think we don't know what you're doing?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, sneaking around, touching things that don't belong to someone like you. The accusation hung in the air, false and sharp, but Lyra had learned long ago that truth mattered less than perception when you were nothing in a world built on everything. She had been assigned to maintain the weapons cache, yet somehow her presence here was still seen as theft, as overstepping, as proof of her inherent wrongness. She finished with the blade in her hands, a beautiful piece with intricate engravings that seemed to shift in the lamplight, and carefully placed it back on its designated rack. The weapon hummed softly as she released it, a sound so low she thought she might have imagined it, and she quickly stepped away before anyone could notice the strange resonance. The morning of the blessing ceremony always brought tension to the pack grounds, but this year felt different, heavier. The Alpha King himself was coming to consecrate the sacred weapons, an honour that happened perhaps once in a generation, and every blade, every dagger, every ceremonial sword had to be perfect. Lyra had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working before dawn and long after sunset to ensure that not a single weapon bore even the faintest tarnish. It was the most important task she had ever been given, and despite Marcus's accusations, she had never touched anything beyond what was required for her duties. Well, almost never. Hidden beneath her thin mattress in the servants' quarters lay a blade she had discovered 3 months ago, wedged behind a loose stone in the armory's oldest wall. The weapon was unlike anything in the official collection, its steel gleaming with an inner light that defied explanation, its hilt wrapped in leather so soft it felt alive beneath her fingers. She had tried to report the finding, had approached the weapon master with news of the hidden blade, but he had dismissed her with the same irritation he showed whenever she spoke. Probably just some old training sword someone misplaced. Handle it yourself, and so she had, cleaning it with the same care she gave all the sacred weapons, except this one responded to her touch in ways that made her breath catch and her heart race. The blade sang when she held it, not audibly, but in her bones, in her blood, in places she couldn't name. The engravings along its surface seemed to move in her peripheral vision, forming patterns that looked almost like writing in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Ancient, royal, sacred. Marcus was still watching her, waiting for some response to his accusations, but Lyra had perfected the art of becoming smaller, quieter, less substantial, until people forgot she was there at all. She gathered her cleaning supplies, her movements careful and deliberate, and began to retreat toward the armory's exit. But as she reached the doorway, she heard the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats, dozens of them. The rhythmic thunder of the Alpha King's approach, arriving earlier than expected for the ceremony that would sanctify every weapon in their collection. Every weapon except the one hidden beneath her mattress. The blade that hummed with power and possibility. The sword that felt like destiny in her hands, even though she was nobody, nothing, invisible. The Alpha King was coming, and Lyra had never been more terrified of being seen. The true mating ceremony took place beneath the light of the full moon, in the ancient stone circle where her ancestors had ruled for 3 centuries before treachery stole their throne. Lyra stood at the centre of the sacred space, no longer the broken servant girl who had scrubbed floors and absorbed cruelties, but a queen radiant with reclaimed power and the love that had awakened everything she was meant to be. The royal blade rested across her palms like a sceptre, its surface blazing with silver light that painted ethereal patterns on the gathered witnesses. Representatives from every northern territory had come to witness this moment, their presence both validation and political necessity, as the bloodline that had been lost for 24 years finally reclaimed its rightful place. She wore the ceremonial robes that had been hastily retrieved from the royal vaults, deep midnight blue silk embroidered with silver wolves that seemed to move in the moonlight. The ancient crown of House Silvermoon rested on her brow, its weight both foreign and familiar, as if she had been born to wear it but had forgotten until this moment that it belonged to her. The Alpha King approached from the opposite side of the circle, his own ceremonial attire marking him as her equal partner rather than her superior. The political arrangement that had bound him to Lady Celeste replaced by something far more powerful and infinitely more true. The mate bond between them hummed with golden energy that made the very air shimmer, their connection visible to every supernatural sense in the assembly. When he reached her, he went to one knee despite her subtle gesture that it was unnecessary, his voice carrying across the sacred space with words that would reshape the political landscape of the Northern Territories. I, Kieran Blackthorne, Alpha King of the Northern Alliance, reject all previous political arrangements and false bonds. I choose Lyanna Silvermoon, rightful heir to the ancient throne, as my mate, my queen, my equal partner in rule and in life. The declaration sent a ripple through the assembled witnesses, but it was her response that sealed their fate and established the new order that would govern their joined territories. I, Lyanna Silvermoon, daughter of the Lost King, accept the bond that the universe itself has woven between our souls. I claim you as mate and partner, but more than that, I choose you as the man worthy to stand beside me as we rebuild what was stolen from our people. She offered him the royal blade, hilt first, in a gesture that acknowledged him as her equal rather than her subordinate. When his fingers closed over the ancient steel alongside hers, the weapon erupted in silver fire that drove away every shadow, its song rising to a pitch that resonated in the bones of every person present. The mate bond completed itself with a cascade of golden light that left no doubt about the legitimacy of their connection, the universe itself bearing witness to a pairing that transcended politics and touched the very foundations of destiny. But it was more than just supernatural recognition flowing between them now. It was love, fierce and uncompromising, tested by betrayal and attempts at murder, and emerging stronger than any force arrayed against it. Elder Thorne stepped forward with the ceremonial chalice, his ancient voice carrying the weight of tradition, as he spoke the words that had not been heard in the Northern Territories for nearly a quarter-century. By right of blood, by recognition of the ancient magic, by the will of the territories that have waited too long for their rightful ruler, I present Queen Lyanna Silvermoon and her chosen consort, King Kieran Blackthorne. The gathered representatives went to their knees as one, their wolves acknowledging the presence of their restored royal bloodline and the power that flowed through their queen like liquid starlight. But it was the moment when the ceremony concluded that she treasured most, when the political necessities fell away and left only the two of them standing together in the centre of the ancient circle. He cupped her face in his hands, his golden eyes reflecting the silver light of the blade and the mate bond that connected their souls, and when he spoke, his words were meant only for her. You are everything I never dared to hope for, everything I dreamed of when I felt the bond snap into place. My queen, my mate, my heart. She leaned into his touch, the royal blade still pulsing with gentle light between them, and felt the last of her walls crumble as she spoke the truth she had been too afraid to acknowledge until this moment. I spent my whole life being told I was nothing, being treated as less than, but you saw me before I even knew who I truly was. You loved me when I was invisible, and now you stand beside me as I reclaim everything that was stolen from my bloodline. When their lips finally met, the kiss held all the desperate longing of the past weeks, all the impossible hope that had sustained them through betrayal and assassination attempts, all the fierce love that had awakened her power and given her the strength to become who she was always meant to be. The royal blade sang between them, its ancient magic recognizing the completion of something that had been written in the stars long before either of them was born. The lost princess had found her way home, the Alpha King had chosen love over duty, and the northern territories would rise stronger than ever under their combined rule. As they broke apart, still wrapped in each other's arms with the sacred weapon blazing between them, Lyra felt a profound sense of completion settle in her chest. She was no longer searching for her identity, no longer questioning her worth, no longer invisible in a world that had tried so hard to erase her existence. She was Queen Lyanna Silvermoon, chosen by the universe itself to reclaim what had been stolen, protected by a love that had defied every obstacle placed before it, and ready to build a future worthy of the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. The ceremony was complete, but their story was just beginning. 3 months had passed since the coronation, and the Northern Territories hummed with prosperity that hadn't been seen since before the fall of House Silvermoon. Lyra stood in the Great Hall, reviewing territorial reports, the royal blade resting against the arm of her throne, like the living symbol it had become, its gentle silver glow a constant reminder of the power she had reclaimed and the responsibility it carried. The changes had been swift and decisive, guided by a queen who remembered what it felt like to be powerless and was determined that none under her rule would suffer the same fate. The servant quarters had been rebuilt into proper housing, the pack hierarchy had been restructured to eliminate the brutal caste system that had kept so many trapped in poverty, and the training grounds now welcomed wolves of all backgrounds who showed aptitude for combat or leadership. But it was the economic reforms that had truly transformed their society, trade agreements that brought prosperity to territories that had been deliberately kept fractured and weak. The united Northern Realm was becoming a power that other regions approached with respect rather than the contempt they had shown the scattered packs of recent decades. Kieran entered the hall with the easy confidence of a king who knew his place was secure not through fear, but through the love and respect of his people. The mate bond between them had settled into something warm and constant, a golden thread of connection that strengthened rather than distracted from their joint rule. He carried dispatches from the Southern Territories, his expression holding the satisfaction of successful negotiations. The Eastern Pack has agreed to the reparations. His voice carried quiet triumph as he handed her the formal documents bearing official seals, full compensation for the assassination attempts, acknowledgement of your rightful claim, and a pledge of non-interference in Northern affairs. Lady Celeste's surviving relatives have been stripped of their titles and exiled to the borderlands. She read through the agreements with the careful attention of a ruler who had learned to trust but verify, noting the specific terms that would prevent future conspiracies while avoiding the kind of brutal revenge that might destabilize the broader region. Justice, not vengeance, had guided their response to those who had tried to destroy them. The Western delegation arrives tomorrow for the trade summit. She set the documents aside and reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of partners who had learned to share both power and affection. They're bringing proposals for mineral rights exchanges and military cooperation agreements. Apparently, our recent victories have convinced them that alliance is preferable to antagonism. His smile held predatory satisfaction and deep pride in what they had accomplished together. 6 months ago, you were scrubbing floors and being told you were worthless. Now foreign powers compete for the privilege of your attention and alliance. The transformation still amazed her sometimes, the completeness of her journey from invisible servant to queen, whose word carried weight across multiple territories. But it was more than just political power that had changed her life. It was the deep sense of belonging that came from finally knowing who she was, from using her abilities to protect rather than simply survive, from waking each morning beside the man whose soul called to hers across any distance. The royal blade pulsed with gentle warmth as she stood, responding to her contentment with the harmonic resonance that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She had learned to read its moods, to understand when it sensed threats or opportunities, to work with the ancient magic rather than being overwhelmed by it. A messenger arrived with the evening dispatches, bowing with the respect due to rulers who had earned their loyalty through competent leadership rather than inherited privilege. "My queen, my king, urgent word from the Border Scouts." A small group approaches under a peace banner, refugees claiming sanctuary from persecution in the Eastern Territories. Lyra and Kieran exchange glances, their shared understanding flowing through the mate bond without need for words. Their reformed territories had become a haven for those fleeing oppression, and each group they welcomed strengthened their realm while demonstrating the values they claimed to represent. Prepare quarters in the guest hall and have the healers standing by in case any need medical attention. Her orders came naturally, backed by the authority she had grown comfortable wielding for the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. "And send word that they'll be granted audience tomorrow morning if they wish to request formal sanctuary." As the messenger departed, she felt Kieran's hand settle on her lower back, a gesture of support and affection that had become second nature between them. But there was something else in his touch tonight, a tenderness that spoke of secrets he was ready to share, and when she turned to meet his gaze, she saw wonder and anticipation dancing in his golden eyes. "There's something I need to tell you." His voice held barely contained excitement, and the mate bond hummed with emotions too complex to identify through their connection alone. "The healers confirmed it this morning, but I wanted to wait until we were alone to share the news." Her breath caught as understanding dawned, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach, where new life was beginning to grow. The heir that would continue the royal bloodline, the child who would be born to peace and prosperity, rather than the chaos and danger that had marked her own early years. "Our child." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, filled with awe and joy, and the overwhelming sense that their story was expanding beyond even their wildest dreams. The next generation of House Silvermoon, born to a kingdom restored, and parents who chose love over every obstacle placed before them. He cupped her face in his hands, his expression holding all the fierce protectiveness and tender devotion that had sustained them through their darkest hours. A daughter or son who will know from birth that they are valued, loved, destined for greatness, not because of their bloodline, but because of the strength they'll inherit from their mother, who refused to believe she was worthless. The royal blade sang with joy, its silver light dancing across the stone walls like laughter given form, and Lyra felt the last piece of her transformation click into place. She was no longer just the lost princess who had reclaimed her throne. She was a queen building a legacy, a wife beloved by her chosen partner, a future mother preparing to pass on everything she had learned about courage and love and the power that came from knowing your own worth. The northern territories stretched around them, prosperous and peaceful under their joint rule, but it was this moment that mattered most. This quiet evening, when the future announced itself through new life growing within her, when love had created something that would outlast them both, when the servant girl who had once believed she was nothing prepared to give the world a child who would never doubt their own value. 6 months later, Lyra stood on the balcony of the royal chambers as the sun painted the mountains gold, her hand resting on the gentle curve where their child grew beneath her heart. The royal blade lay across the stone balustrade beside her, its silver light soft and content in the evening peace, no longer the weapon of desperate awakening, but the sacred symbol of a bloodline restored and a kingdom reborn. The transformation felt complete now, not just in herself, but in everything around her. The territories that had been fractured and bleeding when she was nothing more than a servant girl now thrived under the joint rule she and Kieran had built together. Children played in courtyards where once only fear had lived, their laughter carrying on the wind like music she had never dared to dream of hearing. She thought of the woman who had raised her, the mother who had died protecting a secret that would have gotten them both killed, and wondered what she would think of the queen her hidden princess had become. The memorial garden below bloomed with silver roses planted in her honour, a quiet space where Lyra often came to remember the sacrifices that had made her survival possible. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, but she already knew who it was through the mate bond that had become as natural as breathing. Kieran emerged from the chambers with 2 cups of the herbal tea the healers insisted was good for the baby, his expression holding the quiet contentment of a man who had found everything he never knew he was searching for. The Northern Territories are officially at peace for the first time in 25 years. He handed her the warm cup and settled beside her against the stone railing, his free hand finding the curve of her belly with reverent gentleness. The last of the rebel factions have sworn fealty, and the trade agreements are bringing prosperity to even the most remote settlements. She leaned into his warmth, marvelling at how natural it felt to be touched with love instead of cruelty, to be valued instead of dismissed, to be seen as precious rather than worthless. The journey from servant to queen had been written in blood and struggle, but it had led to this moment of perfect peace, where she could finally rest in the knowledge that she belonged exactly where she was. "Do you ever think about her?" Kieran's question was soft, understanding flowing through their bond as he sensed the direction of her thoughts. The woman who saved you, who gave up everything to keep you safe until the time was right, every day. Her voice held gratitude and grief in equal measure. She died believing I would live my entire life as nobody special, never knowing that her sacrifices would lead to this. Sometimes I wish I could show her the kingdom we've built, the child we're bringing into a world where they'll never question their own worth. The royal blade pulsed with gentle warmth, and she had the strangest sense that somehow, somewhere, the woman who had been her mother in every way that mattered was watching and proud of what her hidden princess had become. Their child stirred beneath her palm, a flutter of movement that made both of them smile with wonder at the life they had created together. This baby would be born to love and security, raised by parents who understood the difference between power earned and power inherited, guided by the wisdom that came from remembering what it felt like to be powerless. I used to lie awake at night wondering what was wrong with me. The confession came easily now, without the shame that had once coloured every memory of her former life. Why I couldn't shift, why I felt broken, why everyone who looked at me saw someone who would never contribute anything meaningful to the world, but you were never broken. Kieran's voice held the fierce certainty that had sustained her through her darkest moments of self-doubt. You were magnificent, hidden beneath suppression magic and deliberate concealment, but magnificent nonetheless. Everything you needed was always there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She turned the royal blade over in her hands, watching its surface catch the last light of the setting sun, and thought about the night she had first touched its ancient steel. The weapon had recognized her before she recognized herself, had sung with power that belonged to her bloodline, even when she believed she was nobody worth remembering. The blade chose me before I knew who I was. Her words held wonder at the mysterious ways the universe worked to correct its own imbalances. It called to me for years, hidden in that wall, waiting for someone who carried the right blood to claim it, as if destiny itself was guiding me toward this moment, because it was. His certainty flowed through the mate bond like golden honey, sweet and warming. The universe doesn't make mistakes, love. It kept you safe until you were strong enough to reclaim what was stolen, brought me to you when you needed someone who could see past the disguise to the queen beneath, gave us a love powerful enough to overcome every obstacle placed before us. The baby moved again, stronger this time, and Lyra felt tears of joy slip down her cheeks as she imagined holding their child for the first time. A son or daughter who would grow up knowing they were cherished, who would learn to use their power in service of others, who would carry forward the values she and Kieran had fought so hard to establish. What will we tell them about how we met? She laughed through her tears, the sound bright with happiness and infinite possibility. That their father fell in love with a servant girl, or that their mother discovered she was a queen. Both. His smile held all the love that had awakened her power and given her the courage to claim her birthright. We'll tell them that love is recognition, that worth comes from within, and that the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the determination to never let anyone convince you that you are less than you truly are. The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that matched the warmth flooding through the mate bond between them. The royal blade continued to pulse with gentle light, no longer the desperate beacon of a lost bloodline, but the content glow of power at peace with itself. Lyra closed her eyes and felt the completeness of her transformation settle in her bones like benediction. She was no longer the frightened girl who had hidden ancient weapons and absorbed cruelties in silence. She was Queen Lyanna Silvermoon, beloved by her people, cherished by her mate, carrying the future of her bloodline beneath her heart. The lost princess had found her way home, and the kingdom she ruled would flourish for generations to come under the love that had made it all possible. I love you. The words came easily now, natural as breathing, true as the blade that had recognized her worth before she did. And I love you. His response carried 24 years of patient waiting, the joy of recognition, and the promise of forever that stretched ahead of them like an endless golden road. The Northern Territories slept peacefully beneath their protection, and all was finally well. The Alpha King moved through the armory like a force of nature given flesh, his presence so overwhelming that the air itself seemed to bend around him. Lyra pressed herself against the far wall, hoping to become part of the stone, but her eyes betrayed her by following his every movement as he approached the sacred weapons with ceremonial gravity. He was larger than she had imagined, his shoulders broad enough to block out the morning light streaming through the high windows, his dark hair catching gold where the sun touched it. But it was his wolf she could sense most clearly, a massive presence just beneath his skin that made every instinct she possessed scream in recognition and terror. The weapon master stepped forward with practiced reverence, beginning the ritual presentation of each blade. First came the ceremonial daggers, their silver surfaces gleaming as the Alpha King's fingers traced ancient blessings over their edges. Then the training swords, each one examined and consecrated with words in the old tongue that made Lyra's hidden blade pulse against her ribs where she had strapped it beneath her servant's dress. She had panicked when the hoofbeats announced his early arrival, racing to her quarters and binding the mysterious weapon against her body with strips of cloth. It was the only place she could think to hide it, the only way to keep it safe until she could find another solution. But now, with the Alpha King so close, the blade felt like it was burning through her skin, humming with an energy that made her wolf stir restlessly in the depths of her soul. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The Alpha King had gone still, his hand frozen over a ceremonial short sword, his head turning slowly as if searching for something. His wolf was rising to the surface. She could see it in the way his pupils dilated and his nostrils flared, and panic clawed at her throat because she knew, somehow she knew, that he was sensing what she carried. Marcus stepped closer to her, his voice a harsh whisper meant only for her ears. "You're sweating like a guilty thing. What did you steal?" But before she could respond, the Alpha King's gaze found hers across the armory, and the world stopped. His eyes were gold, pure, molten gold, and they locked onto her with an intensity that made her knees threaten to buckle. The hidden blade against her ribs suddenly blazed with heat, not painful, but overwhelming, like sunlight concentrated into liquid fire, and she heard him draw in a sharp breath that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, his movement fluid and predatory, and she found herself frozen against the wall as he stopped mere inches away. Up close, his presence was devastating, his scent wrapping around her like a physical thing, pine and winter wind and something indefinably wild that made her wolf whimper and press against the barriers that had kept her cage for 23 years. "Where is it?" His voice was low, rough, a command that bypassed her mind and went straight to her bones. "I can sense it. Ancient steel. Royal bloodline. Where?" She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the way his wolf was calling to something deep inside her that had been sleeping for so long she had forgotten it existed. The blade beneath her dress pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, its light visible through the thin fabric, and his eyes followed the golden glow with predatory focus. "Show me. Now." The command held the weight of absolute authority, but beneath it she heard something else. Desperation. Confusion. The same recognition that was tearing through her own carefully constructed walls. Her hands shook as she reached beneath her dress, unwrapping the cloth bindings that held the blade against her skin. The weapon came free with a sound like singing crystal, its surface erupting in golden light that made the Alpha King stagger backward with a curse that sounded more like a prayer. The blade was magnificent in the lamplight, its steel gleaming with an inner fire that pulsed like a heartbeat, the engravings along its surface writhing with ancient script that seemed to tell a story of power and bloodline and destiny. But it was the way the Alpha King's wolf responded that stole her breath completely. He shifted without meaning to, just enough for his claws to extend and his canine teeth to elongate, his body recognizing something his mind hadn't yet accepted. His wolf was going insane. She could see it in the way his hands fisted at his sides and his breathing turned ragged. And when their eyes met over the glowing blade, she saw her own impossible recognition reflected back at her. Mate. The word whispered through her mind, carried on a voice that might have been her wolf, or his, or the blade itself. And she watched his pupils blow wide with the same devastating realization. The weapon master stepped closer, his voice filled with awe and confusion. "My king, I don't understand. That blade is not part of our collection. Where did it come from?" But the Alpha King wasn't listening, wasn't hearing anything beyond the call of power to power, bloodline to bloodline, soul to soul. He reached toward the weapon with trembling fingers, and when his skin made contact with the hilt, the armory exploded in golden light that sent every person present to their knees. Everyone except Lyra, who stood untouched in the center of the blazing radiance, the blade singing in harmony with something ancient and powerful that was finally, impossibly, beginning to wake. The private chambers felt smaller with the Alpha King pacing like a caged beast, his golden eyes never leaving the blade that lay between them on the ancient oak table. The weapon continued to pulse with that impossible light, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls and making the very air hum with power that had been sleeping for decades. Lyra stood against the far wall, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, watching him move with fluid grace that spoke of barely contained violence. She had expected punishment for hiding the blade, had prepared herself for exile or worse, but instead he had dismissed everyone else with a snarl that brooked no argument and brought her here, to this room where the weight of impossible truth pressed against her chest like a physical thing. "You have no idea what this is, do you?" His voice was rough, strained, as if the words were being torn from somewhere deep inside him. "What it means, what you are." She shook her head, not trusting her voice, and watched his jaw clench with what might have been pain. The mate bond was there between them now, impossible to ignore, a golden thread that pulled at something in her chest and made her wolf whimper with desperate longing. But he was bound to another, would be mated within the week to the daughter of the Eastern Pack, and what her body recognized as destiny, politics declared as disaster. This blade. He stopped pacing, his hands braced on the table, his shoulders rigid with tension. It belonged to the lost royal house, House Silvermoon, the bloodline that was supposed to rule all the northern territories until they were betrayed and slaughtered 24 years ago. The words hit her like physical blows, each one more impossible than the last. She had heard the stories, everyone had, whispered tales of the royal family that had been wiped out in a single night of coordinated attacks. The Alpha King and his 4-year-old daughter, the Queen, heavy with her second child, the extended family that had governed with wisdom and strength for 3 centuries, all dead, all gone, all except the daughter, who had vanished without a trace and was presumed killed, her body never found. "You're telling me this weapon belonged to a dead child?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended, barely more than a whisper, and she saw something flicker in his expression that might have been recognition or grief or something more dangerous. "I'm telling you." He straightened, his gaze boring into hers with an intensity that made her want to flee and step closer at the same time. "That this blade responds to royal bloodline, that it only sings for those who carry the blood of House Silvermoon, that it has been calling to you your entire life, and you've been too afraid to listen." The accusation stung because it held the weight of truth. She had always been different, always felt like something was missing, like there was a part of herself locked away behind walls she couldn't breach. Her wolf had never emerged, never even stirred until today, and the pack had declared her broken, worthless, a genetic dead end that would never contribute anything meaningful to their society. But what if they had been wrong? What if her silence hadn't been emptiness but suppression, deliberate and carefully maintained to hide something that others would kill to possess? The Alpha King moved around the table, his steps slow and measured, like a predator approaching something that might bolt. When he reached her, he stopped close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell the wild winter scent that made her wolf press against the barriers in her mind with desperate hunger. "Look at me!" His voice was gentler now, but no less commanding, and she found herself obeying before she could think to resist. His golden eyes searched her face with an intensity that felt like being turned inside out, and she watched his expression shift through confusion and recognition, and something that might have been wonder. "Your eyes." He raised one hand as if to touch her face, then caught himself and let it fall. I should have seen it immediately. Silver blue. The exact shade of winter sky, the royal bloodline marker that appears in every generation. She wanted to deny it, wanted to laugh at the impossibility of what he was suggesting, but the blade chose that moment to pulse brighter, its song rising to a pitch that resonated in her bones and made her gasp. The barriers in her mind cracked, just slightly, and for one terrifying moment she felt something vast and powerful stirring in the depths of her consciousness. Her wolf, not broken, not absent, just sleeping, waiting, bound by chains. She was only beginning to understand. "This is insane." The words tumbled out of her, desperate and frightened. "I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I clean weapons and scrub floors, and everyone who has ever looked at me has seen exactly what I am. A servant, a mistake, the girl who couldn't even manage to grow a proper wolf." But even as she spoke, she could feel the lie of it, could sense something ancient and powerful uncoiling in her chest like a serpent made of starlight and steel. The blade sang louder, its light dancing across her skin and revealing things that had been hidden for so long she had forgotten they existed. The Alpha King stepped back, his face pale with the weight of realization, and she saw the exact moment when political duty crashed against supernatural truth and shattered into pieces that would never fit back together. "You're her." His voice was barely audible, filled with awe and terror and something that sounded like grief. "You're the lost princess, the rightful heir to the northern throne, the daughter everyone believed was dead, and the mate bond between them flared to life like fire given form, burning away pretense and politics and leaving only the devastating truth that she was everything he couldn't have and everything his soul demanded he claim. Elderthorn moved through the chamber like a man walking toward his own execution, his ancient hands trembling as they hovered over the blade that had shattered 24 years of carefully constructed lies. The pack's oldest historian had served 3 generations of rulers, had been present the night House Silvermoon fell, and the recognition in his weathered face made Lyra's newly awakened wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. "My king." The old man's voice cracked with emotion as he finally lifted his gaze from the weapon to meet the Alpha King's golden stare. "This blade!" I helped forge the blessing runes myself, watched as the royal artificers bound the bloodline magic into its steel. It was made specifically for Princess Lyanna on her 16th birthday, a weapon that would only sing for those who carried the pure Silvermoon bloodline. The name hit Lyra like a physical blow, ancient and familiar in ways that made her chest ache with longing she couldn't explain. Princess Lyanna, the lost daughter, the child who had vanished the night her family was slaughtered, whose body was never found, whose death had been assumed because the alternative was too dangerous to consider. She found herself stepping closer to the table, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, and when her fingers brushed the blade's hilt, the weapon erupted in silver light that made Elderthorn stagger backward with a gasp that sounded like a prayer. Impossible. He whispered the word like a benediction, his eyes wide with wonder and terror. She was 4 years old, a baby. How could she have survived what destroyed the rest of her bloodline? The Alpha King's jaw clenched with barely controlled violence, his wolf rising to the surface as political implications crashed against personal revelation. Someone hid her, someone with power and resources and the ability to suppress her wolf, to hide her scent, to make her invisible to anyone who might have been looking. Elderthorn nodded slowly, his ancient mind clearly working through possibilities that had been buried for decades. The suppression magic. It would have required constant renewal, daily applications of binding spells to keep her wolf dormant and her bloodline signature hidden. Someone with access to her, someone she trusted enough to approach regularly without suspicion. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity, and Lyra felt her world tilt on its axis as memories she had never questioned suddenly revealed their true shape. The woman who had claimed to be her mother, dead now for 5 years, who had insisted on preparing all her meals personally and had given her daily tonics for her weak constitution. The woman who had wept every time she looked at her, who had called her precious and dangerous in the same breath, who had made her promise to never let anyone know how different she truly was. The woman who had died clutching a silver locket that Lyra had buried with her, never thinking to look inside. "She saved me." The words came out broken, filled with grief and gratitude and the terrible weight of understanding. My mother, the woman who raised me. She wasn't my blood, but she died protecting a secret that would have gotten us both killed. Elderthorn's expression softened with something that might have been pity or admiration. The suppressions would have been agony to maintain, daily pain to keep a bloodline as powerful as yours contained. She sacrificed everything to give you a chance at life, even if it meant you would never know who you truly were. But the Alpha King was pacing again, his movements sharp with barely contained fury, and when he spoke, his voice carried the edge of absolute command. Who ordered the massacre? Who had the resources to coordinate attacks on 12 different strongholds simultaneously? Who benefited from wiping out the royal bloodline and leaving the northern territories without a rightful ruler? The political implications hung in the air like poison, and Lyra felt her newly stirring wolf snarl with recognition of old enemies still breathing, still plotting, still working to ensure that the truth never came to light. The arranged marriage that bound the Alpha King to political alliances, the careful distribution of power that had kept the territories fractured and weak, the systematic elimination of anyone who might challenge the new order. Her entire life had been shaped by a conspiracy designed to prevent this exact moment, this recognition, this awakening of power that threatened to upset decades of carefully constructed control. The blade pulsed in her hands, its song rising to match her growing fury, and she felt something ancient and fierce stirring in the depths of her soul. Her wolf was waking up properly now, no longer the timid whisper she had sensed earlier, but something magnificent and terrible that had been caged for too long. Elder Thorne stepped forward, his voice filled with the weight of ritual and recognition. "My princess." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. The Northern Territories have been without their rightful ruler for 24 years. The bloodline magic in that blade confirms what my eyes can finally see. You are Lyanna Silvermoon, daughter of the Lost King, heir to the ancient throne, and the only one with the power to reclaim what was stolen from your family. The Alpha King stopped pacing, his golden gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she saw her own impossible situation reflected in his eyes. She was the rightful ruler of the territories he had been appointed to govern, the mate his soul demanded he claim, the political disaster that would destroy everything he had built, and the only person who could finally bring justice to those who had murdered her family and stolen her birthright. The blade sang louder, its light dancing across her skin like liquid starlight, and for the first time in her life, Lyra felt the stirring of something that might have been destiny. Lady Celeste arrived 3 days before the mating ceremony like a storm dressed in silk, her golden hair gleaming in the afternoon sun as her entourage swept through the pack grounds with the confidence of those born to rule. She was everything Lyra was not, everything the political alliance demanded, beautiful and powerful and carrying the scent of the Eastern Pack's authority like expensive perfume. Lyra watched from the shadows of the training yard as the Alpha King greeted his intended bride, noting the way his shoulders tensed when Celeste placed her perfectly manicured hand on his arm. The mate bond between them pulsed with his discomfort, a golden thread of connection that made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. But she forced herself to remain still, invisible, the servant girl no one would think to notice. But Lady Celeste noticed everything. Within hours of her arrival, whispers began spreading through the pack like wildfire. The Alpha King was distracted, distant, his attention focused elsewhere when it should have been devoted to his bride. The ceremony preparations felt hollow, performative, lacking the joy and celebration that should accompany such a momentous occasion. And something had changed in the armoury, something about the weapon's blessing that had left witnesses speaking in hushed tones about impossible light and power that defied explanation. Lyra was organising the ceremonial linens when the confrontation came, her hands busy with mundane tasks while her mind wrestled with truths too dangerous to acknowledge. The blade lay hidden beneath her mattress again, its song muted but never silent, and she could feel its pull like gravity drawing her toward a destiny she was terrified to claim. "Well, well," Lady Celeste's voice cut through the afternoon quiet like crystal breaking on stone, the mysterious servant girl who has everyone so fascinated. She looked up to find the Eastern Pack princess standing in the doorway, her pale green eyes cold with calculation and something that might have been recognition. Up close, Celeste was even more devastating, her beauty sharp and predatory, her power worn like armour that had never known defeat. "My lady," Lyra kept her voice steady, submissive, everything a servant should be when addressing royalty, but she saw the way Celeste's nostrils flared as if catching a scent that didn't belong. "You know, I've been hearing the most interesting stories since my arrival." Celeste stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. Stories about strange lights and ancient weapons and servants who forget their place. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Would you happen to know anything about that?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in silk and delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. Lyra felt her wolf stir in response to the challenge, no longer the sleeping presence of her childhood, but something fierce and proud that bristled at the dismissal in the other woman's tone. "I maintain the weapons, my lady, nothing more." The lie came easily, practised after years of making herself smaller, less significant, forgettable in a world that valued power above everything else. But Celeste moved closer, her movements fluid and predatory, and Lyra caught the scent of something darker beneath her expensive perfume. Violence, ambition, the willingness to destroy anything that stood between her and what she considered rightfully hers. "See, that's where things get interesting." Celeste's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Because I've been asking questions, and the answers I'm getting don't quite add up. A servant girl who appeared from nowhere 20 years ago. A child with no history, no family, no pack connections that anyone can verify." Panic clawed at Lyra's throat, but she kept her expression neutral, empty, the mask she had worn her entire life. She had no idea how close Celeste had come to the truth, but the danger radiating from the other woman made her wolf snarl with protective fury. "And then there's the matter of my intended mate." Celeste's smile turned razor-sharp. "Who seems to have developed quite an interest in weapons maintenance lately, who watches you with an intensity that has nothing to do with your skills with oil and polish." The accusation hung in the air between them, deadly as poison, and Lyra felt the mate bond flare with distant anguish that wasn't her own. The Alpha King was suffering too, torn between duty and desire, political necessity and the call of his soul, and the knowledge that her very existence was causing him pain made her chest ache with guilt and longing. "I think there's been some mistake." Her voice came out smaller than she intended, but Celeste was already shaking her head with predatory satisfaction. "Oh, there's been a mistake, all right." The Eastern Princess stepped close enough that Lyra could see the golden flecks in her pale green eyes, could smell the violence lurking beneath her perfect composure. "The mistake was thinking I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't investigate, that I would simply accept a political marriage to a male whose attention was elsewhere." The threat crystallized between them, sharp and immediate, and Lyra understood with devastating clarity that her secret was no longer safe. Celeste might not know the full truth yet, but she was close enough to be dangerous, and the political alliance she represented had too much at stake to allow any obstacles. "Let me be very clear." Celeste's voice was silk wrapped around steel. "The mating ceremony will proceed as planned. The Alpha King will fulfill his obligations to my pack and to the greater good of the territories, and anything that threatens that outcome will be eliminated." She turned toward the door, her movements graceful and deadly, but paused with her hand on the handle to deliver one final blow. "It would be such a tragedy if something happened to you before the ceremony. Accidents happen so easily to those who aren't careful about where they place their loyalty." Then she was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and barely concealed threat, and Lyra sank to her knees as the full weight of her situation crashed down around her. She was the lost princess, the rightful heir to a bloodline that others had killed to possess. She was the Alpha King's true mate, bound to him by forces that transcended politics and duty, and now she was a target, marked for elimination by a woman who had the resources and motivation to make good on her threats. The blade beneath her mattress pulsed with sympathetic power, its song rising to match her racing heartbeat, and for the first time since the awakening began, Lyra wondered if some truths were too dangerous to survive. The abandoned training ground lay shrouded in pre-dawn darkness when Lyra arrived with the royal blade strapped against her back, its weight both foreign and familiar as she moved through the shadows like a ghost learning to be solid. The Alpha King was already there, waiting in the centre of the circle where moonlight carved silver patterns on the worn stone, his presence calling to something deep in her bones that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. You came. His voice held surprise and relief in equal measure, and she realized he had been uncertain whether she would risk the danger of meeting him in secret. The mate bond between them pulsed with warmth that cut through the cold morning air, a golden thread of connection that grew stronger every time they were alone together. She drew the blade, its surface immediately blazing with inner light that turned the darkness into something magical and alive. The weapon sang as it came free, a sound that resonated in her chest and made her newly awakened wolf pace with restless energy beneath her skin. Teach me. The words came out steadier than she felt, but she had spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about Celeste's threats and the political forces arrayed against them. If she was going to survive what was coming, she needed to be more than a lost princess who had just discovered her heritage. She needed to be dangerous. The Alpha King circled her slowly, his golden eyes assessing her stance, her grip, the way she held herself with the blade in her hands. You've never been trained. His statement carried no judgment, only observation, but she felt heat rise in her cheeks at the reminder of how unprepared she was for the world she had been thrust into. My wolf was suppressed. Her voice carried bitter acknowledgement of years lost, potential deliberately caged. I couldn't learn what I couldn't access. But things are different now. As if summoned by her words, her wolf stirred more actively than ever before, pressing against the barriers in her mind with growing confidence. The suppression magic was failing, worn down by truth and proximity to the mate bond, and she could feel power gathering in her chest like a storm waiting to break. The Alpha King moved behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders to adjust her position, and the contact sent electricity racing through her entire system. His touch was gentle but sure, guiding her body into proper alignment, and she found herself leaning into his warmth despite the danger such closeness represented. Feel the blade's balance. His voice was low, intimate, meant only for her ears. It was made for your bloodline, crafted to be an extension of your will. Don't fight it. Let it teach you. She closed her eyes and reached for the connection she had been sensing since the blade first sang in her hands, allowing her consciousness to flow into the ancient steel like water finding its level. The weapon responded immediately, flooding her mind with muscle memory that belonged to generations of Silver Moon warriors who had wielded it before her. Her body moved without conscious thought, executing a series of strikes and parries that felt like remembering rather than learning. The blade cut through the air with liquid grace, its light painting silver arcs in the darkness, and she heard the Alpha King's sharp intake of breath as power she had never accessed began flowing through her movements. Incredible. He stepped back to give her room, his expression filled with wonder and something that might have been pride. Your bloodline remembers what your mind forgot. The blade is unlocking centuries of training, passing down the skills of every warrior who came before you. She spun into a complex sequence that left her breathless but exhilarated, the weapon moving like it weighed nothing, like it was part of her own body given steel and edge. Her wolf was rising closer to the surface now, lending supernatural speed and strength to her movements, and for the first time in her life she felt truly alive. But it was more than just combat training flowing through the ancient steel. As she moved, images flashed behind her closed eyelids, memories that belonged to the blade itself. Her father teaching her mother to fight in this same circle 25 years ago, their love a blazing thing that had defied political expectations. Her grandfather standing victorious over enemies who had threatened the pack, the blade singing with righteous fury. Generation after generation of rulers who had protected their people with this weapon, who had chosen love over duty and strength over submission. The blade pulsed brighter, responding to her emotional connection with its history, and she felt something unlock deep in her chest that had nothing to do with combat skills and everything to do with identity. She was not just learning to fight, She was reclaiming who she had always been meant to be. When she finally opened her eyes, the Alpha King was staring at her with an expression that made her breath catch. The mate bond flared between them, golden and inevitable, and she saw her own desperate longing reflected in his gaze. "You're magnificent." The words were barely a whisper, filled with awe and desire and the terrible weight of impossibility. "Everything I knew you could be, everything I dreamed of when I felt the bond snap into place." She lowered the blade, its light dimming but never disappearing entirely, and took a step toward him that felt like stepping off a cliff into open sky. They were alone in the darkness, wrapped in the intimacy of shared secrets and growing power, and the space between them felt charged with potential that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the call of soul to soul. "This is dangerous." Her voice came out husky, uncertain, but she didn't step back when he reached for her, his fingers trailing along her jaw with reverent gentleness. "Everything about this is dangerous." His thumb traced her lower lip, and she felt her wolf arch into the touch like a cat, seeking affection. "But I can't stop, can't pretend the bond doesn't exist, can't ignore what you are, what we are together." The blade in her hands pulsed with sympathetic warmth, its magic responding to the emotional intensity crackling between them, and she realized that her awakening power was tied not just to her bloodline, but to the mate bond that connected their souls. The stronger their connection became, the more her abilities manifested, as if love itself was the key that unlocked everything she had been denied. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin, and she felt the world narrow to this moment, this choice, this impossible thing that felt more real than anything else in her life. But before their lips could meet, a sound shattered the intimate silence. Footsteps, multiple pairs, moving with deliberate stealth toward their hidden sanctuary. They sprang apart as figures emerged from the shadows, and Lyra's blood turned to ice as she recognized the leader. Lady Celeste, flanked by guards from the eastern pack, her pale green eyes glittering with triumph and malice. How touching! Celeste's voice dripped with false sweetness as she stepped into the circle, her gaze fixed on the still glowing blade in Lyra's hands. The servant girl and her secret lessons. Though I suspect there's more to this story than simple combat training. The trap had been set, and they had walked into it with their eyes closed, blinded by desire and the desperate need for connection. Now the consequences were bearing down on them like wolves in winter, and Lyra gripped the ancient blade tighter as she prepared to fight for both their lives. The mating ceremony was 2 days away when the first real attempt on her life came, swift and silent as winter death sliding through the shadows of the servants' quarters. Lyra woke to the whisper of steel through air, her newly sharpened instincts screaming danger before her conscious mind could process the threat bearing down on her in the darkness. She rolled from her narrow bed as the assassin's blade buried itself in her pillow where her head had been seconds before, feathers exploding into the air like snow in a blizzard. The royal weapon was in her hands before she fully understood how it had gotten there, its familiar weight singing with deadly promise as her wolf surged toward the surface with protective fury. The assassin was a professional, dressed in black from head to toe, his face covered by a mask that revealed only cold eyes focused on her death. But he had made one critical error in his planning. He had expected to find a helpless servant girl, not a warrior princess whose bloodline carried centuries of combat instinct. She met his second strike with the royal blade, steel ringing against steel in the confined space, and felt the ancient weapon guide her movements with supernatural grace. The suppression magic was failing faster now, worn down by constant awakening and the proximity of the mate bond, and power flowed through her like liquid fire. The fight was brief and brutal, ending when she opened his throat with a precision that belonged to her ancestors, the blade moving like it had a mind of its own. The assassin fell without a sound, his blood dark on the stone floor, and Lyra stood over his body with her chest heaving and her wolf howling with savage satisfaction. But there was no time to process what she had done, no moment to grieve the innocence she had lost with her first kill, because even as the assassin's blood cooled, she heard voices in the corridor outside, guards responding to some fabricated emergency that would bring them to her quarters at exactly the right moment to find her standing over a dead body with a bloodied blade in her hands. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Murder the servant girl and frame it as an accident, or let her defend herself and paint her as a dangerous killer who threatened the pack's stability. Either outcome served Celeste's purposes, removing an obstacle while discrediting any claims Lyra might make about her true identity. She was already moving, wrapping the royal blade in a length of cloth and securing it against her body as footsteps thundered closer. The window was her only escape route, a narrow opening that led to a precarious drop into the courtyard below, but her enhanced abilities made the leap manageable where it would have been suicide before her awakening. She landed in shadow and rolled to absorb the impact, then melted into the darkness between buildings as shouts erupted from her former quarters. They would find the body soon, would begin searching for the servant girl who had vanished in the night, and she had perhaps an hour before the entire pack was hunting her as a murderer. The Alpha King found her in the sacred grove, where moonlight filtered through ancient branches, his face pale with barely controlled rage and something that might have been relief. She was sitting against the trunk of a silver birch, the royal blade across her knees, its light painting ethereal patterns on the bark around her. "They're saying you killed a guard." His voice was carefully neutral, but she could feel his wolf pacing beneath the surface, could sense his struggle between duty and the mate bond that insisted she was innocent regardless of evidence. "I killed an assassin who came to murder me in my sleep." Her words were steady despite the trembling that had started in her hands the moment the adrenaline faded. "The first of several attempts, I suspect, now that Celeste knows I'm a threat to her political arrangement." His expression shifted from uncertainty to deadly fury as the implication sank in, his wolf rising closer to the surface with each word. "She sent someone to kill you." It wasn't a question, and the rage in his voice made her chest ache with the weight of impossible circumstances. "The ceremony is tomorrow night." Her voice came out smaller than she intended, heavy with the knowledge that time was running out for all of them. "After that, the alliance will be sealed, and my existence becomes even more inconvenient for those who profit from the current arrangement." She stood slowly, the blade singing as it moved with her, and watched him struggle with the political reality that bound him like chains. He was honour-bound to proceed with the mating ceremony, locked into agreements that had been years in the making, and she was the chaos that threatened to destroy everything he had built. But the mate bond between them pulsed with desperate need, a golden thread that grew stronger with every moment they spent together, and she could see the war being fought behind his eyes. Duty against desire, political necessity against the call of his soul, the future of the territories balanced against the love that was consuming them both from the inside out. "I found evidence." Her words cut through his internal struggle like a blade through silk, and she saw him go still with predatory focus. In the assassin's belongings, letters detailing payment arrangements, orders that came from someone with access to Eastern Pack resources. She pulled the blood-stained papers from her pocket, documents she had found sewn into the assassin's leather vest, and watched his face darken as he read the carefully coded instructions. The conspiracy was broader than either of them had imagined, reaching into multiple packs and political factions, all united by their determination to prevent the royal bloodline from reclaiming power. "They're not just trying to eliminate me." She kept her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "They're planning something for the ceremony itself, multiple contingencies to ensure that any threats to the new order are permanently neutralized." His hands fisted around the letters, his wolf surging so close to the surface that she could see the gold bleeding into his human eyes. "You're not safe here. The ceremony will be a death trap, and I'll be bound by protocol to stand beside Celeste while they murder you in the name of political stability." The pain in his voice matched the ache in her chest, where the mate bond pulled toward him with desperate longing. They were running out of time, running out of options, caught between forces that would destroy them both rather than allow their connection to threaten the carefully constructed balance of power. Then we changed the game. The words came out of her with quiet determination, and she felt something shift in her chest as the royal blade pulsed with sympathetic power. They want to use the ceremony as a trap, make it the stage for my elimination. But what if we turn their weapon against them? His gaze sharpened with dangerous interest, his wolf recognizing the challenge in her voice and rising to meet it. "What are you thinking?" She smiled, and for the first time since her awakening began, she felt like the warrior princess her bloodline demanded she become. "I'm thinking it's time to reclaim what was stolen from my family. And if they want to make it a public spectacle, then let's give them a show they'll never forget." The mating ceremony erupted into chaos when the mercenaries struck, their attack timed for the moment when all eyes should have been on the Alpha King and Lady Celeste exchanging sacred vows. But instead of a helpless servant girl cowering in the shadows, they found a warrior princess standing in the centre of the ceremonial circle with the royal blade blazing like a star in her hands. Lyra had known they would come. The evidence she'd found on the assassin's body had revealed the full scope of their plan, multiple kill teams positioned throughout the celebration, ready to eliminate her the moment she showed herself. What they hadn't expected was for her to claim the stage for herself, to step forward as the ceremony reached its climax and announce her true identity before the assembled witnesses. "I am Lyanna Silvermoon, daughter of the Lost King, rightful heir to the Northern Throne." Her voice carried across the stunned silence, amplified by power that made the very air shimmer around her. "And I challenge the legitimacy of this union and the political arrangements it represents." The words had barely left her lips when the first wave of attackers emerged from the crowd, their faces covered, their weapons drawn with lethal intent. But her wolf was fully awake now, no longer the sleeping presence of her childhood, but a magnificent silver beast that surged through her consciousness with predatory grace. The royal blade moved like liquid lightning in her hands, its ancient steel singing with the voices of every warrior who had wielded it before her. She cut through the first attacker's guard with surgical precision, opened the second's throat with a backhand strike that scattered blood across the sacred stones, and spun to meet the third with a combination that left him crumpled at her feet. But there were too many of them, emerging from every direction with coordinated precision that spoke of extensive planning and considerable resources. She found herself fighting on multiple fronts, the blade blazing brighter with each opponent she faced, her movements flowing with supernatural speed and strength that belonged to her awakened bloodline. The Alpha King's roar shook the ceremonial ground as his wolf exploded to the surface, his human control shattered by the sight of armed killers converging on his mate. He shifted mid-leap, his massive form crashing into a cluster of mercenaries with bone-crushing force, his fangs finding throats with predatory efficiency that left no room for mercy. They fought as perfect partners, moving in harmony that transcended conscious thought, their wolves recognizing each other as complementary halves of a greater whole. Where she was precision and grace, he was raw power and unstoppable force. Where he created openings through brutal strength, she exploited them with surgical strikes that dropped opponents before they could recover. Lady Celeste's scream of rage cut through the sounds of battle, her carefully orchestrated plan crumbling as her hired killers fell to the very prey they had been sent to eliminate. "You ruined everything." Her voice cracked with fury and desperation as she drew her own blade, its surface gleaming with poison that would kill with the slightest cut. Years of preparation, political alliances that took decades to forge, all destroyed by one worthless servant girl. But Lyra was no longer the broken thing that had scrubbed floors and absorbed cruelties in silence. She was a warrior queen reclaiming her birthright, and when she turned to face Celeste, the royal blade in her hands pulsed with power that made the Eastern princess stumble backward with sudden terror. I was never worthless. Her voice carried the authority of ancient bloodlines and claimed power, echoing across the battlefield where the last of the mercenaries were falling to the combined fury of the Alpha King and his loyal guards. I was hidden, suppressed, deliberately kept from discovering who I truly was, but those days are over. Celeste lunged with desperate fury, her poisoned blade seeking the heart that had stolen her political future. But Lyra met the attack with movements that belonged to centuries of Silvermoon warriors. The royal blade turned the strike aside with contemptuous ease, then continued its arc to open Celeste's wrist, sending her weapon spinning away across the blood-stained stones. The Eastern princess fell to her knees, clutching her wounded arm, her pale green eyes wide with the realization that everything she had worked for was crumbling around her. The political alliance lay in ruins, her mercenaries were dead or dying, and the mate bond between the Alpha King and the lost princess blazed like golden fire that no amount of scheming could extinguish. But it was the Alpha King's choice that sealed their fate, his public declaration that echoed across the ceremonial ground and into the hearts of every witness present. "I reject this false union." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he stood beside Lyra, his hand finding hers over the hilt of the royal blade. "I claim Lyanna Silvermoon as my true mate, my equal partner, my queen." The blade erupted in silver light that drove away every shadow, its song rising to a pitch that resonated in the bones of everyone present. The mate bond between them completed itself with a cascade of golden energy that left no doubt about the legitimacy of their connection, the universe itself bearing witness to a pairing that transcended politics and touched the very foundations of destiny. The pack went to their knees, not in submission, but in recognition, their wolves acknowledging the presence of their rightful Alpha Queen and the power that flowed through her like liquid starlight. Even the political representatives from other territories found themselves bowing before the undeniable truth of what she had become. Lady Celeste's conspiracy lay shattered, her allies exposed, her mercenaries defeated by the very prey they had hunted. And in the centre of it all stood Lyanna Silvermoon, no longer hiding from who she was, no longer apologizing for the power that ran in her veins, no longer invisible in a world that had tried so hard to erase her existence. The lost princess had come home, and the Northern Territories would never be the same. The aftermath of the failed ceremony stretched across 3 days of political upheaval that would reshape the Northern Territories for generations to come. Lyra stood on the balcony of the Alpha King's private chambers, now rightfully hers as well, watching delegates from a dozen different packs navigate the courtyard below with the careful steps of those walking through a minefield of shifting alliances. Everything had changed in the space of a single evening, but the hardest battles were still being fought in council chambers and private negotiations, where words carried as much weight as the blade that had carved her path to recognition. The Eastern Pack's delegation had departed in disgrace at dawn, Lady Celeste's surviving family members fleeing before formal charges could be brought against them for conspiracy and attempted murder. The political marriage that had taken years to arrange lay in ruins, and with it the carefully balanced power structure that had kept the territories fractured and weak since her family's fall. But not everyone was ready to accept the return of the Silvermoon bloodline, and Lyra could feel the tension radiating from the great hall below, where heated arguments continued to rage about legitimacy, succession rights, and the inconvenient truths that her survival represented. The Alpha King found her there as the sun reached its zenith, his presence announcing itself through the mate bond before he ever appeared in her peripheral vision. The golden thread between them had settled into something warm and constant, no longer the desperate pull of recognition, but the steady comfort of souls that had found their perfect match. The Northern Council is demanding proof. His voice carried the weight of political reality, but she could hear the underlying anger at those who dared question what the Blade and their bond had already confirmed beyond any doubt. They want documentation, bloodline records, witnesses to verify your identity beyond the weapon's recognition. She turned to face him, noting the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he held himself when discussing the ongoing political challenges. The past 3 days had aged him, the responsibility of defending her claim while maintaining stability weighing heavily on his conscience. And what proof would satisfy them? Her question held no bitterness, only curiosity about the lengths some would go to deny what their own eyes had witnessed. They saw the Blade respond to my touch, watched me fight with abilities that only the royal bloodline possesses, felt the mate bond complete itself before their entire assembly. He stepped closer, his hands finding her waist with the easy intimacy that had developed between them since the ceremony's dramatic conclusion. Some of them will never be satisfied, no matter what evidence we provide. They profited from the fractured territories, from the power vacuum your family's death created. Your return threatens everything they've built. The brutal honesty of his words should have frightened her, but instead she felt only the calm determination that had been growing stronger since her awakening began. She had spent 24 years believing she was nothing, accepting the world's judgment of her worth, and she would never again allow others to define what she deserved or who she was allowed to be. Then we give them a choice. Her voice carried the authority she was still learning to wield, but it felt natural now, like speaking in a language she had always known but forgotten how to use. Accept the legitimate restoration of the royal bloodline, or face the consequences of continued opposition. His smile held predatory satisfaction, and something that might have been pride, the alpha queen I knew you could become, the woman who stands up and demands the respect she's earned, rather than begging for scraps of recognition from those who would deny her birthright. But even as he spoke, she could sense his underlying worry through their bond. The knowledge that some of their opponents would choose violence over acceptance, would rather see the territories burn than acknowledge her claim. The conspiracy that had tried to kill her at the ceremony was only the beginning, and the enemies who remained would be more careful, more dangerous, more determined to succeed where Celeste had failed. A knock at the chamber door interrupted her thoughts, and she felt the Alpha King's posture shift into protective alertness as Elder Thorn entered with scrolls that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The ancient historian's expression held triumph and something that might have been vindication as he approached with careful reverence. "My queen." The title fell from his lips with natural ease, as if he had been waiting decades to speak it aloud. "I bring proof that will silence even your most stubborn detractors. The lost archives, hidden in the sacred vault since the night your family fell, preserved by those loyal few who believed the bloodline would one day return." He unrolled the first scroll with trembling hands, revealing genealogical records traced in silver ink that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Birth records, bloodline documentation, formal recognition of the royal heir born 24 years ago during the winter solstice, all bearing the official seals that no amount of political manoeuvring could forge or dismiss. But it was the second scroll that took her breath away, a detailed account of the night her family died, written in her father's own hand during the hours before the final assault. His desperate plan to save his daughter, the trusted allies who had agreed to hide her identity, the suppression magic that had cost everything but given her the gift of survival. "Your father knew the end was coming." Elder Thorn's voice cracked with emotion as he read from the ancient parchment. He spent his final hours not preparing for battle, but ensuring that the royal bloodline would survive to reclaim what was stolen. These documents name you specifically, describe the blade that would recognize you, Detail the suppression methods that would hide your true nature until the time was right. The Alpha King took the scroll with reverent care, his eyes scanning the formal language that confirmed everything they had fought to prove. This is irrefutable. No council, no political faction, no ambitious rival can dismiss documentation that bears the royal seal and describes events that have come to pass exactly as written. Lyra felt something settle in her chest, a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying, finally lifting as the last doubts about her identity crumbled into dust. She was no longer the lost princess searching for proof of her heritage. She was the rightful queen reclaiming her throne, backed by documentation that made her authority unquestionable. Send word to the Northern Council. Her voice carried new confidence, the certainty of someone who no longer needed to prove her worth to others. The bloodline records are available for their inspection, but the time for debate is over. I am Lyanna Silvermoon, and I claim the throne that is mine by right of blood, by recognition of the ancient magic, and by the will of the territories that have waited too long for their rightful ruler. The Alpha King's hand found hers over the precious documents, their mate bond flaring with shared purpose and unshakable resolve. Tomorrow we make the formal announcement, establish the new order, and begin the work of rebuilding what was lost. But tonight they would celebrate the victory that had seemed impossible just days ago, when she had been nothing more than a servant girl with a secret that could destroy everything. Now she stood as a queen beside her chosen king, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them as partners in power and love.